Hello, second grade. It's Mrs. Keller again. Today, earlier we talked about worms, and we read a fiction story called The Diary of a Worm. And now I would like to read to you a story that is a nonfiction story about worms to give you a little more information about how worms help us. So today on BookFlix, I also found It Could Still Be a Worm. How long is a worm? About as long as this worm, if it's a common earthworm, the kind you usually find in gardens. So worms help us in gardens. They help our plants and our vegetables grow. A really big earthworm might reach from the top to the bottom of this book. Some are even longer than that. When you look closely at an earthworm, you see that its body is made up of many rings or segments. I know that when we learned about learning new words, if I didn't know what the word segments meant, I could look around the word and I see that it says many rings. So segments mean many rings. Remember, we can still use our strategies as we're reading. It moves with the help of hairs like the bristles on a brush. How many of you knew that worms actually had these little hairs? A worm could be much, much smaller than an earthworm, and it still be a worm. Some roundworms are so tiny that 100 of them could stretch out end to end on this little line. Or a worm could be longer than an automobile and still be a worm, like this giant Australian earthworm. Ooh, that worm looks longer than some snakes. A small farm might have more worms than a big city has people. You wouldn't see most of them because they spend so much time underground. Worms make tunnels in the earth called burrows. Burrows must be tunnels. Earthworms that come out of their burrows after dark are called night crawlers. People who go fishing in lakes or rivers often use night crawlers to attract the fish. We have night crawlers around where we live. Not all worms live in the earth. A worm could live in the sand along a beach or swim in the ocean and still be a worm. A sea worm or a ribbon worm. So another word for sea worm is a ribbon worm. They look a lot different than the worms that we have around here. Not all worms have dull color. A worm could be bright red, orange, or blue and still be a worm, like this ribbon worm. Some ribbon worms are no more than 1 inch, but others are the longest of all worms. I remember before it said that the ribbon worms live in the ocean. A worm could have a flat body and still be a worm, a flatworm. Here's an amazing fact about flatworms, ribbon worms, and some kinds of earthworms. If they are cut into 2 or more pieces, each piece can live by itself as a whole worm. But please don't go around cutting up worms. There are thousands of kinds of worms. Worms are not insects. Some animals that look like worms are really young insects that haven't yet grown into their adult form. I bet many of you have seen this kind of, it's actually around here, it's actually a caterpillar that turns into a butterfly. Some kinds of roundworms or flatworms can be harmful. They cause diseases among people or farm animals, or they damage crops. But earthworms play an important part in nature. They are food for birds and many reptiles and mammals. Earthworms break up the soil by digging their burrows. This makes it easier for air and moisture to get inside the soil. So, as you know, we need worms, and animals need worms, and the worms also need us, and they need the environment that we live in. Interdependence of plants and animals. Worms eat dead leaves and soil and turn them into worm casts. Worm casts. I wonder what worm casts are. I look at this picture and I think that is when the worm goes to the bathroom. Air, moisture, and worm casts all make the soil richer. Bigger, healthier plants can grow in it. So again, we need those worms. So an animal might help grow the fruit and vegetables you eat and the flowers you look at and still be a worm. I hope you enjoyed this story and you learned a little bit more about earthworms and how we need them and how animals need them and plants need them. I hope you have a great day, second grade.